today. So we're going to talk today about how you go through that sort of process of requesting early intervention and really special education services in general. So mainly this is going to be focusing on sort of ages 3 and up, which we'll talk about. Go ahead to the next slide. So this again fits in really nicely to our case presentation today. What are some of the early signs that your child might benefit from early intervention or IEP services? And so when we're looking at these sort of preschool age kids, especially, we're thinking about, is there trouble, adapting to some of the classroom routines? Maybe a child who's primarily been at home and transitions into some kind of preschool setting. How does that go? And how are they able to adapt to those new routines? Frustration with communicating, which I think certainly heard with this little girl too, that, her way of communicating was sort of that frustrated or moving away rather than, being able to really engage and tell people what she wants and needs. Limited interest in peer interaction. Also by, age 4, that can definitely be a little bit of a warning sign that we want to look at things a little more and see why this child maybe isn't interested in peers or isn't engaging with peers. Fixation on objects rather than functional play. So that didn't come up quite as much in this case, but that could be another sign, if we're seeing that a child by, 3 or 4 really isn't using toys necessarily in the way they're intended, but maybe, playing with them or using them in an unusual way. That could be a little bit of a warning sign. Transition challenges. So, moving maybe from a preferred to non-preferred activity. What does that look like? Is that something that we can help, work on? Or are we having a lot of behaviors around that? And then sensory differences are something we also want to kind of keep in mind really through all of these processes as we're thinking about, what are some warning signs or some things that might mean we want to look a little further at how development's going for this child. Go ahead to the next slide. So this slide, I think it sounds like many of our participants today are pretty familiar with some of what exists within sort of special ed and early intervention, which is great, but it can be really confusing, especially if this is something brand new. And, in this case, family who has no other children, doesn't really have family members around. And there's lots of acronyms that get thrown around and, lots of different, unfamiliar phrases that are used. So we kind of just use this slide to illustrate how confusing that can be. But the big IDEA in the middle, the red letters, is sort of going to be the guiding principle that we're going to be using to talk about things today. And this is actually the federal law that governs special education services in the United States and sort of helps lay out how families can go through this process and what their rights are and what things should be available for children. Go ahead to the next slide. And so what is IDEA? You can just kind of click through till all the words are up. Thank you. So IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And so again, this is that federal law that is going to ensure special education services for children with qualifying disabilities. And this term that we have bolded here, this free, appropriate public education, is really a key sort of phrase. And we'll hear that called FAPE. And, this is really helpful for parents to understand that, we have a system in place that says every child is entitled to those things, a free, appropriate public education. So, whether they have significant delays or need support, they are still entitled to receive education services. And it's the state or, the government's and the local school district's responsibility to make sure that we're providing whatever services are needed so that child can continue to make progress. So when we're talking about birth to 3 years, this is typically called early intervention. I know we do have them flipped. So part C should be birth to 3, early intervention. Part B is 3 to 21, all part of the same law. But when we're thinking birth to 3, we're really looking more at sort of natural environment, early childhood development. So this is technically not going to be a special education service happening in a school setting. Usually this is still going to be services happening in the natural environment, in the home, really supporting families. And this is with our most, our very youngest children typically. And then when children turn 3, all the way up through age 21, they're going to be potentially eligible for special education services. And in Pennsylvania, we have something called intermediate units in all of our counties, except Philadelphia. That's called, it's Elwyn, but really functions in the same way. Those intermediate units are going to provide the services from 3 until school age, and then from school age all the way through up to 21. This is going to be provided by the public school district. In many other states, those services are going to be the responsibility of the public school district from age 3. So someone just commented up to 22. Yes. So in Pennsylvania, there were some recent policy changes where individuals can stay in school till 22. Different states are a little bit different in terms of what they have as that sort of cutoff. So I've heard of some other states that also allow up through 22. But in general, we're talking about sort of ages 3 to 21 in a more general way. We can go to the next slide. So what is early intervention? Again, this is a term used to talk about the different services and supports that are available to babies and young children with developmental delays and disabilities and their families. And this can include a whole variety of different types of services: speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, special instruction, behavior support, and lots of other things, really determined by the evaluation and what the team decides is going to be the right kind of support. Go ahead. So when we're talking about that birth to 3, again, where we're talking really more about natural environment and not technically special education yet. This is going to be in the natural environment, and services are going to be outlined in an IFSP, Individualized Family Service Plan. So this plan will still have some different goals and priorities, and it will sort of help document what services we're offering. But these services that are really going to be focused on sort of what's going on in the day-to-day environment for that child, helping support families, sort of helping work on those really early developmental skills that we want to see build. And so we have listed here the main contact numbers for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, but every state will have some system in place for 0 to 3 early intervention services. And those programs have different names depending on what state you're in, but they're all guided under that same law. So they're all going to have a lot of really similar components. And, families can reach out and can request an evaluation if they have concerns. And that's something that happens free of charge. If their child is determined to be eligible for these services, some states do have a sliding scale or copay for those services. Pennsylvania does not. So all early intervention services are free of charge for families in Pennsylvania. And then, as we said, when child turns 3, then we're really talking about these as special education services. So this same law is still going to be the one that's sort of impacting the policy around this. We talked about that free appropriate public education. And then the other really important term here is least restrictive environment. So this really says that children with disabilities still have the right to get their education in the least restrictive environment that's appropriate for them. And sometimes that means, that they are with sort of typically developing peers. For some students, that might mean they do better in a small group, or that they do better with a teacher who really understands their specific disability. But we always want to be looking back and sort of re-examining that and making sure that, we are keeping that student in the least restrictive environment possible. We have a couple questions. I'll jump over to those real quick. So what's the cutoff for early intervention? So again, from birth up until the 3rd birthday, it's going to be those sort of natural environment early intervention services. On the 3rd birthday, the responsibility moves over to the public school system, whether that's their school district or the intermediate unit. And the cutoff in terms of upper age is whenever they call it the age of beginners. So when a student transitions into kindergarten. And different states have slightly different guidelines around that. So we're typically talking about 5 or 6 is when most kids go to kindergarten. But sometimes, there are cases where a child may have a birthday close to a cutoff, or families might keep them back a little bit longer, but usually 6 is about the latest that somebody would still be getting early intervention services. Okay, and Katie, I think, answered the other question that was in there. So going back to this slide, again, under this under IDEA, public schools and public charter schools have to work to support children with disabilities by providing them with these services. And so to determine what kind of special education services a child might need, they have to go through a certain process that is going to begin with an evaluation. And we're going to now kind of go through what that process looks like. So this is sort of a nice outline of the main steps within the special education process. So we're going to identify, evaluate to determine eligibility. Then we're going to look at whether this individual qualifies for an IEP. And then we're going to develop the services and monitor that progress. And then we're going to reevaluate. So we're always kind of going back to make sure this is still working. And yes, so when somebody, once they're age of beginners, I see this question about 8-year-old, once they've started school, so kindergarten all the way through whatever point someone graduates, then this same process is going to apply. It's still going to be special education. It's just no longer going to be considered early intervention because we're going to be school age now. And so we're going to be getting those services as part of our school-based program. And go ahead to the next slide. So this is the process of child is identified as possibly needing services. And this is meaning like, we've seen this 4-year-old, we're noticing some signs that, maybe we're concerned. She's not playing as much as we'd like to see. She's not communicating quite where we'd want to see a 4-year-old. So now we're looking at maybe she's going to need some support. So who can request that initial evaluation? That can be school personnel, it can be parents, or sometimes this might come through a pediatrician or other provider who knows this family really well. Where they might say, I think we're going to make a referral and we're going to request this evaluation. So I see we have a couple great questions coming in. I'll address this one about if a child has a medical diagnosis of autism. This is, I think, asking to clarify, does the school automatically classify the child as needing autism services? And the answer to that is no. And we'll talk, as Katie said, they aren't necessarily eligible. So this is why we kind of go through this special education eligibility process, because it is different than the medical process. And so often the two will end up coming to the same conclusion, but not necessarily. And so this is really important for parents to understand that this sort of stands separate from that medical evaluation they may have gotten. So within the special ed process, once we've made that referral, and we're going to, either by parents or maybe a preschool's suggesting it, we make that official referral to early intervention if they're under 3. This is that 0 to 3. Or what we're really mainly talking about today is sort of that 3 through 21. So that referral is going to go to the local public school or IU. And the local education agency then reviews that and makes a determination if they think this is a referral that, yes, we're going to go through and determine eligibility and do an evaluation. And if that's the case, then the child's going to go through what we would call typically a multidisciplinary evaluation. And someone asked, I think, about different team members, which we'll get into a little bit. But typically, this is the process. As we've made that referral, the school or the LEA agrees that they're going to go ahead and do this evaluation, and then we're going to start that process from there.
Okay, thanks, Susanna. So this directly relates to the question we just got about the multidisciplinary evaluation. This is the special education eligibility determination. It also is very similar for early intervention, as Susanna touched on. The idea here for special education is to inform, first, is the student eligible for special education services? And then if the answer to that is yes, to inform IEP or individualized education program development, which we'll get to in a moment. So we need to have an understanding of the student's strengths, their needs, what goals would be appropriate based on their age and needs. The types of assessment that are included in a multidisciplinary evaluation include cognitive or intelligence testing, academic, behavioral, occupational therapy, and physical therapy to assess motor skills and adaptive behavioral skills or adaptive living skills, and speech and language or communication, including whether or not the student or individual might have a need for alternative communication. Next slide, please. So following that multidisciplinary evaluation, and the note there is that we say multidisciplinary because one, it must address those many different areas, and two, it cannot be reliant upon one single assessment or measure. So the idea is that this is something comprehensive and across disciplines and areas of strength and needs. If the student is determined to be eligible for special education services, because they have a disability classification that falls into one of those 13 categories under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it impacts their learning needs, an individualized education program or IEP would be developed. The core or the heart of the IEP are those learning goals. This establishes what the student will learn over the next 12 months. In other words, what their goals are in relation to the general education curriculum. The purpose of these goals and the purpose of the IEP as a whole is to enable the student to meaningfully access and participate in the general education curriculum alongside their peers with and without disabilities. The IEP goes into detail about what services the school will provide. This might include related related services that we'll get into in just a moment. Some examples are speech and language, physical therapy, occupational therapy, social work and counseling. And specifies what accommodations and modifications are needed for the student to make progress. So that might be including accommodations across their assessments and modifications such as specially designed instruction that educators in the school will engage in order for the student to make progress toward those learning goals. Next slide, please. So the question of who is on the team for the individualized education program. So we got the question about the multidisciplinary evaluation. And so the note about that is that that will include a team of people who are certified and credentialed to be administering the evaluation. So that varies depending on the measures. It'll be a different person qualified to do a speech and language evaluation as opposed to someone qualified and able to do an IQ test. So it will almost always be a series of professionals or a group of professionals doing that multidisciplinary evaluation. At least one of those people needs to be on or someone with similar qualifications needs to be on the IEP team. You'll see there, it's the second bullet from the bottom, an individual who can interpret the evaluation results. That's because the results of the evaluation or re-evaluation, if the student already has an IEP, need to be interpreted or discussed at those following IEP meetings. But the other members of the team would be the parent or the guardian, at least one general education teacher, at least one special education teacher, the child when appropriate. So beginning in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, a child at the age of 14 needs to be invited to their IEP meeting because transition planning will be discussed. I always say this as a special educator who focuses on inclusion. I believe that from a young age, even the very youngest of school ages, it is appropriate to include the child in at least a small way. You may not have them there as you're going in depth over some of the extensive kind of paperwork or going into the evaluation results. But when you're talking about the learning goals or talking about the student's strengths, that might be a great place to include the child and to begin to show them that the role they will play in self-directing some of their learning and plans throughout their education. A representative of the public agency or LEA, that will often be someone from the school. We already noted the person who can interpret the evaluation results, and then anyone else with knowledge of the child who the school might wish to invite or the family might wish to invite. That can include someone like an advocate. I know that was mentioned earlier in the chat here. Next slide, please. So how was the IEP developed? I went into this a bit as I first introduced the IEP, but what's important to note is that there are some key timelines here. So the timelines are established at a federal level under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then some states actually have stricter timelines. But generally, you would consider the entire process that we note here as being about 90 days. So from the time when consent is received to do the evaluation, there's 60 days for that evaluation to get done. And then after the evaluation has been complete, the team must meet to develop the IEP within 30 days. That's the guideline at the federal level. And so I noted it may actually be stricter depending on the state. The IEP is then written based on the needs described in the evaluation report. A draft is usually prepared in advance of the meeting, and it is reviewed and edited during the meeting. I would note a couple of things for families that are becoming more common. You may wish to say we'd like to review the draft before the meeting so that we can come prepared to talk. I think something we've recognized within special education is at times families have felt like an IEP is given to them at the meeting as opposed to being the draft from which it is discussed and developed. So that might just be one consideration. You can also request to take home what was developed at the time because you need a bit more time to review and discuss that. Next slide, please. So what does the IEP include? And because we'll be running up against our time here, I'll go over these bullets pretty quickly. But there are two slides here that go over the areas you'll see in the IEP. So at the front, you're going to see those general information, the revisions, IEP team signatures, procedural safeguards. That's kind of that paperwork piece that I'm noting. It also just will include some basic information about the child, like name, home address, date of birth, special education classification, etc. Special considerations are noted here, as are the present levels of academic and functional performance. Those, again, are based on the results of the evaluation, as well as ongoing progress monitoring if the student has had an IEP previously. Transition services, again, across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, this is included once a student turns 14. Federally, it's always at least by the age of 16. There will be notes about the student's participation in state and local assessments. So they may actually take the assessment as is and no accommodations are needed. They may also take it with accommodations, or perhaps if they're among that generally about 1% of students with the most intensive support needs, they would take an alternative assessment. Next slide, please. Okay, so what else? Now here, I would say we get into the meat of the IEP, the goals and objectives. If a student is taking the alternative assessment, it is actually required that they have short-term objectives aligned with those goals. Many schools, just as a best practice, include them for most IEP goals for all students because it's helpful to do progress monitoring. It gives a clearer direction to instruction and supports. But those goals and objectives need to be measurable, specific, and aligned with the general education curriculum. Then section 6 goes over special education, related services, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications. So that's pretty self-explanatory. That can include anything and everything. This can be quite creative, and this is really where a lot of discussion can take place at the meeting. I see a quick question. By law, does an interpreter have to be available if the family speaks another language? Yes. And materials have to be made available in that language as well. And I love that. The person says, I include a picture of my child in the IEP meeting to serve as a reminder who I'm advocating for. Yes, that's absolutely fantastic. And then lastly, the educational placement section. So someone earlier made a note about the least restrictive environment. This is where we explain where the student will spend their time. We always want to start from a place of what is possible to meet the student's needs in what would be the most inclusive environment. So starting from the general education classroom with their peers with and without disabilities. And then from there, we evaluate what other settings might be needed in order to meet the needs of the child and enable them to make progress toward those goals. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our last slide here for our informational section, knowing your rights in special education. One slide certainly cannot sum this up, and there's a lot to this. There are a lot of different supports available, and we can share some of those, I believe, as part of our resources from today. But really at the heart of this is that every child with and without a disability is entitled to a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE. And that's entitled to FAPE in the least restrictive environment. So that means spending as much time as possible alongside their peers with and without disabilities in the general education setting, with keeping in mind that at times other settings or environments may be needed in order to meet their needs. The IEP is a legal document and must be followed as needed. At times, an IEP, I think historically, has been something created and then locked away in a filing cabinet. I always say we should think of it as a living document. It's not something we just return to once a year. It's something we review regularly and edit throughout the year as needed. It may be that we recognize that a student met a goal very rapidly, and so another goal needs to be set. Or perhaps we related service that we've now recognized a need for was not initially there, and that can be added throughout the year. So please know that it's not just once a year that this is something that gets edited. Put things in writing. If you have concerns regarding your child's IEP, document those concerns in writing along with the district's response. Again, just having that paper trail can be a really valuable tool as you look at a child's progress over time. We never want to think about moving immediately to litigation or something of that matter, but at times we do need to have some difficult conversations, and it's really valuable to have as much documentation as you can. And then just lastly, as a parent or guardian, for those of you here who are family members, you are a critical part of the IEP team and are entitled to and should have a voice in developing your child's support plan. So that's all for us on the special education process today, but we have lots of resources to share.
Okay, so we are coming up on 2:30, but we have time for questions or comments. People have been so engaged in this whole session, and there have been great questions coming through, and everybody was great with the case discussion as well. We've got about 10 minutes for questions if anyone has any. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd rather kind of unmute and ask a longer question. If it's too hard to type it out, that's perfectly fine.
I did get one private message. I'm just checking as to whether or not that person is comfortable with me sharing with the group, or if that's something they wanted to remain one-on-one. Great.